So, let's talk about domestic terrorism. It's a phrase we hear all the time, right? But what are we actually talking about? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the long and honestly pretty surprising history of this threat right here inside America's borders and take a look at the huge challenge of how to stop it.
The United States is no stranger to domestic terrorism. That quote from our source material really hits home, and it's the perfect place for us to start, because this isn't some new 21st century problem. It's a shadow that's been following the nation for a very, very long time.
Okay, so before we go any further, let's get on the same page. What does domestic terrorism actually mean? What's the definition we're working with here?
Well, here it is, the official definition from the FBI. And the key thing to notice is that it's not just random violence. It's violence with a purpose, to scare people, to force the hand of a government, to push some kind of political or social goal. And of course, it all happens right here within the U.S.
So we've got the definition down. But how has this threat actually shown up in the real world? Well, it turns out domestic terrorism has been a moving target for more than 100 years, constantly changing its face, its methods, and its reasons.
Yeah, and this timeline, wow. It really gives you a glimpse into that long and frankly very diverse history of attacks on American soil. It's a pretty sobering look at how long this has been a part of the American story.
I mean, just look at the sheer range here. You go from the Mountain Meadows Massacre way back in 1857, which was driven by religious extremism, to the Wall Street bombing in 1920 by anarchists, to the horrific, racially motivated Birmingham church bombing in 1963, and then you have something totally different, like the anti-technology campaign of the Unabomber. The motivations are just all over the map, spanning the entire political and social spectrum.
But it's not just the why that has changed. The source material we're looking at points to this really fundamental shift in the who, the actual people carrying out these attacks, and that change has created a whole new headache for law enforcement.
See, for a really long time, domestic terrorism was a group activity. You had organizations, cells, people working together. But now, we are seeing this dramatic rise of the lone wolf. This is just one person acting completely on their own, and that makes them incredibly hard to find before it's too late.
So, that's the big question, right? If the threat is this shapeshifter, moving from big groups to single individuals, what on earth can you do to stop the violence before it even happens?
All right, let's get into some of the core strategies that our source material outlines for prevention. And it's not just one thing. It's a few different layers working together.
You can think about prevention like a three-layered defense. The very first layer is socialization, basically teaching nonviolence and empathy in our communities, in our schools, from the ground up. The second layer is about addressing the root causes, right? Providing help and resources to people who are struggling before that anger gets channeled into violence. And then there's the third layer, kind of the last line of defense, incapacitation, just making it physically impossible for someone to carry out an attack.
Now, here's an idea from our source that might seem backwards at first. Threatening these attackers with punishment, a lot of the time, it just doesn't work. And why is that? Because for so many of them, they truly believe they have nothing left to lose. So how do you deter somebody who just isn't afraid of the consequences?
And that, of course, brings us to the really difficult part of this whole equation. Prevention is always the goal, but it's not a guarantee. So what happens when it fails? How does a city, a country, respond when the unthinkable actually happens? To get a handle on what a really effective crisis response looks like, let's turn to a modern example from the source material. 264. That's how many people were injured in the Boston Marathon bombing back in 2013, and they were all rushed to 26 different hospitals all across the city. You can just imagine the scale of that medical and logistical challenge. It's just immense. But right in the middle of all that chaos, something pretty remarkable happened. The city's response was a masterclass in being prepared. Not a single hospital got overwhelmed. Patients were sorted and moved with just incredible speed and efficiency. Now, this wasn't some kind of miracle. It was the direct result of years and years of training, planning, and really strong leadership.
So what does that kind of leadership actually involve when you're in the thick of it? Well, it boils down to these 5 critical tasks. First, you have to limit the immediate damage and help people recover. That's the on-the-ground logistics. Second, you organize communication. Think of those clear, constant press briefings that kept everyone in the loop. Third, you have to make tough, decisive calls, like shutting down an entire city to hunt for the suspects. Fourth, and this is fascinating, you help with meaning-making. You shape the story of what happened. Think of the phrase, Boston Strong. That was a deliberate choice to build a narrative of resilience, not victimhood. And finally, You hold people accountable and make damn sure you learn lessons so you're even better prepared for next time.
Which brings us to our final and maybe most unsettling thought. In terrorism, nothing but the names, the causes, and the technology really changes. This quote from our source is such a powerful reminder that while the details might shift, the who, the why, the how, the fundamental threat of domestic terrorism seems to be a constant. It's a sobering idea that leaves us with a really tough question. Is this a fight that can ever truly be won, or is it a challenge that every generation will have to learn to manage?